Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Falcon Oil Gas Limited investor presentation. Throughout this recorded presentation, attendees will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged. They can be submitted at any time via the Q&A tab that's just situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. Please just simply type in your questions and press send. The company may not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company can review all questions submitted today and will publish those responses where it's appropriate to do so on the Investor Meet Company platform. Before we begin, I would just like to submit the following poll, and as usual, if you could give that your kind attention, I'm sure the company would be most grateful. And I would now like to hand you over to CEO Philip Quigley. Philip, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Jake, and thank you, and welcome everybody from wherever you are. We had our AGM this morning in Dublin, a well-attended AGM. We had some people flew in from Midland, Texas, and London, which was great to see. And then we went into a presentation and a Q&A, which is what I'm going to focus on for the next 35 minutes. So I hope you can see in front of you the presentation material, which I'll flick through. Got a bit of ground to cover this afternoon. I'm going to talk about our well results that we announced earlier this year. We'll go into a bit of detail about the exciting pilot program that's going to kick off the next couple of months. Talk a little bit about this 3D seismic program, which is part of our pilot program that we'll be out acquiring 3D. And then I want to talk about this whole US technology and experience already in the Beetaloo, but more with even coming again as we move through into the pilot. And then two other areas I want to touch on today. One, dealing with the drill spacing units, what it means, how it affects Falcon, what has affected Falcon so far, and the future of how the Beetaloo gets developed on these drill spacing units. And then an introduction to this concept, which may be new to a lot of you outside of the US, certainly is the checkerboard, which I'll touch on. So quite a lot to get through. Q&A certainly at the end. We do have some pre-submitted questions. I'm hoping this presentation will generate some more, perhaps if you wait until the end of the presentation before submitting, so I don't cover answering off those questions, as you've already submitted them. So it'll be easier if you hold off questions until the end. So as I said, let's start first with the results that we announced earlier this year. Before we get into our own specific results on this map here, you look on the left-hand side, we talk about the Emungi wells that we drilled, in particularly the Emungi 1 that we went back in 21 and retested that, and had this really, really good flow rate of 5.2 to 5.8 million scf of gas a day. So that got us all pretty excited back in September 2021. You'll all remember, of course, with the unfortunate well results from 2H, which was not reservoir related. So we're pretty happy with the reservoir around this area. And we have also drilled another well at 3H, which we actually haven't tested that. We've just suspended that well for the moment. If you look over to the east of the slide, in particular the Tanumbirini wells, which are in the deeper part of the basin, these wells are operated by Santos at 75%, and Tamboran are a 25% non-operated partner. These wells are pretty good results too, coming in at 3.3 and 5.2 million scf of gas on the IP30 as normalized over 1,000. So again, very, very encouraging results, as too with the results from Empire as well as drilled in the shallower area of the Carpentaria area. So all results to date were all pretty good. Working with Tamboran, as our operator, and they take that information that they gained from their own operator, Santos, at the Tanumbirini, we moved our focus of drilling away from Emungi down to this deeper part of the basin. Similar kind of depth terrain as the successful Tanumbirini wells, and that's when we landed our Shenandoah well. And true enough, we got fantastic results that we announced earlier this year. We were looking for, kind of a north of 3 million scf of gas a day, normalized over 1,000 meters, and we got 6.4 million. So truly a fantastic result. And that result was giving all of us, the JV partners, the confidence then to move forward with the pilot program, which of course I'll touch on. Before doing that, let me just talk a bit more detail about the results. As I said, the 30-day IP rate came in at 6.4 normalized. We then ran it for a further 30 days, and we had this IP 60 at 6 million scf. And then another 30 days, we finished a testing at 90 days in total, and it came in at 5.8 over normalized over the 90 days, 5.8. So what that tells you is you have a nice slow decline curve, which is exactly what you want to see. When you extrapolate what that might look like in future wells, that of course will be 3,000 meters horizontal, you'll be looking at something in the order of 19 million scf of gas a day on an IP30. And that's kind of puts us in around some of the best wells that are being drilled in the Marcellus Shale in the US. And not only do the flow rates compare very well to the Marcellus, so too do the geological properties. Geological properties such as reservoir pressure, porosity, gas in place, all very positive in terms of when you look at the very, very successful Marcellus shale. In terms of how that slow decline looks like, this next line gives you exactly what it looks like. The blue line being the daily flow rate, and that orange line above is the cumulative flow rate over the 90 days. So nice, slow, steady decline over 90 days. And that would kind of hopefully lead, that kind of a decline rate will hopefully lead to a pretty encouraging and a significant EUR, estimated ultimate recovery, in the kind of the high teens, 17, 18, 19 BCF per well, yet to be determined. But that certainly would be our expectations. This next slide is just another way of looking at the comparable flow rates we've had across the Beetaloo. The first two wells, the Empire wells, the Carpentaria wells, 3 and 2, then the Tanum-Marini wells, and then, of course, the last one being our Shenandoah well. And every time we drill, these wells get better. We get better at drilling them. Moving to the deeper area in our Beetaloo, the Shenandoah area has certainly proven to be a very, very good and very smart move by our operator, Tampa. So all encouraging date so far. And then lastly, on the results, again, I come back to this, the geological properties of the Beetaloo compared to the Marcellus. And when you look at things like gas in place, porosity, saturation, TOCs, every which way you look at the Beetaloo, it actually beats the Marcellus. So when we look at it, it exceeds, or at least in line with, tier 1 Marcellus shale properties. So again, hugely encouraging. And it's hugely encouraging too, because it's these kind of results that's getting a lot of attraction in the US of A, which again, I'll talk a bit more about when I talk about the US expertise and technology coming to the Beetaloo. So having dealt with that, let me now talk a little bit about the pilot program. And as I said, the results we had to date earlier this year has given us all confidence to move to the pilot program. And the area of the pilot program will be just 4 kilometers, 2.5 miles north of the Shenandoah well. We're simply just stepping across this license boundary up from EP 117 across into 98. It's the exact same geological address as the Shenandoah well. We'd expect the results to be identical or very similar to what we experienced earlier this year. The program itself is a pretty exciting program, 6 wells in total, all 3,000 meters horizontal. We'll be drilling the first 2 of those wells starting in the next month to 2 months, hopefully before the end of July. And we'll then hopefully we'll be bringing in Liberty Energy, who I'll talk a bit more about, coming in to frack both of those wells before the end of 2024. And then one of those wells we most likely will put on an extended production test, which we will do that into and beyond the end of this year and into the new year. But initial results we expect from these 2 wells, we would have initial results certainly by the end of the year. And then following those 2 wells, we'll be back drilling in April, May next year, drilling 4 3,000-meter horizontal wells, out then fracking all of those wells as soon as they're ready to be fracked, and running parallel with that drilling fracking program will be gas gathering and compression facilities to be installed. So that when we have the wells all drilled, ready to hook up to production, we'll have the gas gathering compression facilities in place, ready to go. And then the last piece of the infrastructure will be roughly a 30-kilometer, 18-mile pipeline connecting the pilot area itself to what's known as the AGP, the Amadeus Gas Pipeline. And that's work that will be undertaken by APA, a very, very large Australian utility company. And then the gas from the pilot, very importantly, we have signed a binding gas sales agreement with the Northern Territory government to sell gas at a rate of 40 million scuffs of gas a day. That's a kind of a 9-year contract with an option by the Northern Territory government to extend it for a further 6.5 years. And as we've identified before in earlier press releases, we elected to reduce our participation in the pilot from 22.5% to 5%. I'll explain a bit more why we did that and what it means for the future and Falcon's participation in the pilot going forward and in areas around the pilot. So just I've touched on things like the pipeline, the Amadeus pipeline, which runs kind of adjacent to our property, that we've got to build this 30-kilometer, APA will build this 30-kilometer pipeline to hook up our pilot gas into that pipeline, take that gas into the Northern Territory, into our customer, the Northern Territory government, as I said, at a rate of 40 million scuffs of gas a day, 9 years plus an option to increase it to 6.5. So that's the existing infrastructure. There's a dotted line here in this graph. That's just a potential future pipeline past the pilot. It's not a pipeline that's been built yet or commissioned or anyone, but that would be a potential route. One of the routes actually to export gas out of the Beetaloo will be down to this junction here called Balera. And then the other obvious route at time would be to go north up into Darwin, into the various LNG facilities there, should there be capacity available to do so. Now, I mentioned too, as part of the program of work we're doing this year in terms of drilling the 6 wells this year and next, we'll also be out shooting 3D seismic in and around the area. So we're going to acquire about 330 square kilometers of 3D, covering about 80,000 acres. And that will be very useful going forward in better identifying structures, faults in the area, and better having a better idea where best to locate the next wells, what direction to drill the next wells in post the pilot. So that's a valuable piece of data we'll be acquiring before the end of this year. So I talked about US technology and experience, and there's a lot of it coming. It's been in the Beetaloo now for over 2 years. It started basically with Brian Sheffield coming into the Beetaloo back at the end of 2021, when he made his initial investment in Tambo Resources. He followed that up with an investment in Falcon by the following March 2022. He's made subsequent investments in Empire, the other operator in the Beetaloo. He's acquired a 38.75% interest in our JV, and he's acquired overriding royalty interests from Tamboran, from Falcon, and from Empire. In total, Brian has invested of his own personal money roughly $125 million US. So that's a significant endorsement for what he believes the Beetaloo's potential to be. And on top of that, Brian runs a funds called the Formentera Funds in the US, going after onshore US shale plays, been hugely successful. I think he's got $1.5 billion under management in Formentera, and he's now set up a dedicated Formentera Australia fund, and he raised $120 million last December to basically follow his direct 38.75% interest in the Beetaloo. So this is in addition to his $125 million already invested. And the last point on this is, Daly Waters, aka Brian Sheffield, has the option for future operatorships, which I'll talk to when I address the introduction to the checkerboard later on. In addition to Brian coming in from, as I said, a US expertise, US money, US know-how, US experience, US success, H&P joined the Beetaloo and were brought into the Beetaloo by Tamboran. And they came in last year. They drilled 2 wells. In fact, they drilled the Shenandoah well. They also drilled the third well at the Mungie 3H well. And these are big players. These are, as you can see on this slide, they've got 152 active rigs last quarter, market cap $3.5 billion. And the H&P Flex rig, which Tamboran acquired or under contract from them, is good until August 25. But Tamboran then also has a 10-year option to contract for additional 5 more rigs from H&P as we move forward post the pilot development. And H&P, in addition to mobilizing their rig to the Beetaloo, they've also invested 35 million Australian dollars in Tamboran over the last year or so, and appointed their senior VP for H&P International onto the board of Tamboran. So another great US endorsement of the Beetaloo. And last, but by no means least, is Liberty Energy. These are the newest US entrants to Beetaloo. To me, I think they're significantly important. They bring with them, they're the 4th largest oil field service provider in North America, a large company of $3.8 billion turnover last year, $4.7 billion. And they're mobilizing a fracking fleet to the Beetaloo as we speak, working with the likes of H&P, who already done it a year ago, how to get there, mobilizing everything to Darwin. And they'll be in country in time to frack these first 2 wells we'll be drilling before the end of the summer. So they'll be out there fracking those wells. They have all the expertise. It's not just their fleet, their fracking fleet they're going to mobilize. It's also their personnel, US personnel coming to the Beetaloo with US technology, US experience. So it's a huge step up from where we've been. We've got Brian Sheffield, H&P, Liberty Energy. As I said, the Beetaloo is becoming more and more Americanized in a very, very positive way. In addition, as you see on that slide, Liberty also invested $15 million cash in one of Tamboran's most recent equity raises. So that's as I said, the US experience and technology. I want to talk a little bit about drill spacing units and participating interest, particularly as it relates to Falcon. And as I go through this, there's a lot of numbers on these next 2 slides. Hopefully it'll generate a couple of questions. Please feel free to pop those questions up when I've got through the presentation. But I think it's important to understand how the drill spacing units work and when and why they were introduced back in September 2022. So as Origin was exiting the Beetaloo and entering was Daly Waters, aka Brian Sheffield, together with Tambourine to pick up Origin's interest, we introduced this whole DSU concept into the Joint Operating Agreement, the JOA. And what it means is, instead of us having a 22.5% interest in 4.6 million acres, we now have a 22.5% interest in each and every DSU, a drill spacing unit. And by and large, most DSUs will be 6,400 acres in size, so 10 square miles roughly. There are certain circumstances where a DSU will be as big as 25,600 acres. And that happens where you have a licensed commitment well, a commitment to the government to drill a certain well. And if you're drilling in a new area and that well is nominated as a commitment well to the government, well, then it automatically creates a DSU of 25,600 acres. So to date, we've since the introduction of the DSUs, the Shenandoah well that we drilled at the end of last year, that created a large DSU. Yes, it was a commitment well. It's not 25,600 acres, it's slightly less because the well wasn't up to a 3,000 meter horizontal, which triggers the full extent of the largest DSU. So it's a slightly smaller DSU of 20,480 acres. And Falcon owns 22.5% of that because that's the level of participation. The next 2 wells to be drilled, as in the first 2 wells this year, which will be hopefully July, August for the first and August, September for the second, these are commitment wells. They will be creating 2 new DSUs, and each will measure 25,600 acres. So we've got 22.5% interest in the first DSU. We will only have 5% in these 2 new DSUs, and I'll explain on the next slide why we've done that. There is a potential that these 3 DSUs may be combined into one at some time in the near future. And if we do that, the simple maths across 22.5% of 20,000 and 5% of the 51,600 gives you a kind of a weighted average interest for Falcon of 10%. So we could see our interest in the enlarged, if it gets enlarged to this larger area and it all gets combined into one larger DSU, our interest goes from 5% across up to 10%, which is a nice kind of, when we look forward, post the pilot, we can be at 10% and not to be stuck down at this 5%. But right now we're participating at the 5% in the pilot, but post the pilot, there may be an opportunity for us, if these get amalgamated into one larger DSU, that we'll be at 10%. There's also what we talk about, the first strategic development area. I'm throwing a lot of numbers out here and new concepts out here, but I'll touch on this first strategic development area when I go and talk about the checkerboard in a couple of slides later. So just in terms of future DSUs and commitment wells, there are, I believe, beyond these 2 wells in 24, there's another 1 or 2 commitment wells to be drilled before the end of 2027, which is the end of our current license term. And these wells will create 2 new DSUs because they'll be drilled away from the current area. And they will also then measure 25,600 acres. But I think it's important to note that most DSUs going forward in the Beetaloo will be 6,400 acres. And even though that to some people in the oil and gas world, particularly in the US of A, 6,400 acres might seem like an awful lot of acres in terms of 10 square miles. But it is a large area we have. And when you look at 6,400 acres being one DSU, do bear in mind we've got 718 of them if they're all 6,400 acres. So we can navigate our way around whether we choose to go into a DSU or not. For example, if there's a future DSU to be drilled in 27 or 28, and for some reason we don't like the area, we don't like the risk associated with the new area and the geology of it, we can drop down to 0. And we drop out of 1/718th of our total. If we drop to 0, obviously we have to stay at 0. But then all the areas around it, we can go back in when new DSUs get created, we can go back up to 22.5%. So it gives huge flexibility to Falcon today and going forward. So again, just to finish off on the DSU, a lot of questions came in as to why did we reduce down to 5% of this pilot program. When you look at the gross acreage, 4.6 million acres, which is a net 1 million to Falcon. When you look at what we've given up by reducing from 22.5 down to 5, we've given up 17.5% of 51,000 acres, which is roughly 9,000 acres. So we've effectively relinquished our entitlement or our right to participate in 9,000 acres, which represents 0.87 of 1% of our total acres. So not a lot to give up, yet we still are participating. The Beetaloo will get proven up with this pilot. Part of the reason of going to the 5 is to do effectively with the cost of the pilot. And when you look at Tambourine's own estimates contained in a recently published and filed S1, they're looking at a total cost to them, not for the whole pilot, but Tambourine, of $165 million US. Simple grossing up of that, you get close to $350 million. So if we were to do, and sorry, included in that then is outside of drilling and fracking, is the gas gathering compression, which will come in at about $86 million. Were we to participate at 22.5% across all of the pilot activity, starting now until the end of next year, we would have needed to raise $78 million. We also opted out, apart from going from 5% on the drilling of these wells, we actually dropped to 0% on the gas gathering compression. This is kind of the midstream part, which has been taken up by Tambourine and Daly Waters. There may be an opportunity in the future where this will simply be just being warehoused by them, that they may sell this in its entirety or mostly to a third party who come in and operate that as a midstream operator. But right now, we have elected to go to 0%. So our share of this pilot, the 5% of the pilot, the 0% of the gas gathering, effectively is going to cost us 10 to 13 million US dollars, which is a net cash saving of 65 million. And when you look at our market cap of 65 million relative to 100 million market cap, that's a significant dilution we've avoided by not raising 65 million and diluting our shareholders by 65%, at the same time giving up 0.87 of just 1% of our acres. And when you park the pilot and you look past the pilot, and what does this actually mean? And the great benefit of these DSUs means that we can never get drilled out. We can never get outspent by our partners. If the capital is not there, if we don't like the geology, we drop down to 0. We don't lose anything. Well, we do. We lose 1/718th of our acreage. While they drill up that area that we may not be in, they're proving out everything else around it. So we've removed the risk of not being able to keep up with our partners, and we protected our shareholders' interest in the Beetaloo literally for the life of the project. So I think the significance of these DSUs is huge. So if that wasn't enough in terms of numbers to slightly confuse you, I want to now move on to the checkerboard, which is it's not connected to the DSUs. The checkerboard is, again, from a US perspective, they'll be very familiar with acres get checkerboarded out in the Permian Basin. And it is, as it suggests, it's a checkerboard. So there'll be kind of uniform squares, black and white, for example, or red and white, whatever you want. This checkerboarding concept is a 50-50 JV between Tambourine and Daly Waters. Falcon are not party to how the checkerboard gets done. It is simply an agreement at the Daly Waters Tambourine JV level. And either Daly Waters or Tambourine have the right to propose the implementation of a checkerboard strategy. But Daly Waters, importantly, has first selection on which checkerboard it wants, and then the second selection goes to Tambourine and back and forth until all checkerboard pieces have been allocated. Important also to note in terms of the timing, when is it likely that the checkerboard will be implemented? Well, all I can say is that there is a cash penalty must be paid by Tambourine to Daly Waters of 7.5 million or 50 million in Tambourine stock by the end of this year if the checkerboard is not implemented. And payment of these amounts of money to Daly Waters does not alleviate the requirement of checkerboard. So, for example, if it's not done by 31 December, those payments in either cash or shares have to be made, and the checkerboard still has to be executed sometime after that. So what is a checkerboard block, and what's the size of a checkerboard block? Well, each block will contain what's called in the Northern Territory area 10 graticular blocks. And a graticular block is roughly 20,000 acres. So each checkerboard piece will measure a huge 200,000 acres, and they will be divided evenly. And it'll be divided even across what we call the ILUA, the Indigenous Land Use Agreement area, which we've identified. It's roughly 1.2, 1.3 million acres. It's that area itself will be then split into 6 areas of 200,000 acres each. And then each of those areas, each of those checkerboard pieces will then be advanced to a production license. So I said the initial area to be checkerboarded is this 1.2, 1.3 million acres. The balance of 3.3 million will be checkerboarded at a future date. So we're just talking about doing the initial checkerboarding, hopefully by the end of this year. It might run into next year. And what it then means is Tamboran will own and operate 77.5% of 3 of those blocks. Daily Waters will own and operate 77.5% of the other 3 blocks. Interestingly, Falcon will be the only player to have an interest in both. So we'll have 22.5% interest in both blocks. In terms of scale of these blocks, I talked about the 200,000 acres. Each block could contain up to 500 wells. And if one was to assume an EUR of 18 BCF, well, then potentially you're looking at each block having a staggering 9 TCF of gas, just for one single block. And there are 6 just in the initial 1.3 million acres. I talked about the first strategic development area, 88,000 odd acres, it might be a little bit less, around the pilot to be excluded from the checkerboard, because clearly no one would want the checkerboard to include the pilot and then Daily Waters to have option over the pilot and Tamboran is out. So that can't happen. So what will happen is there's an area larger than the pilot area itself, larger than the 51,200 acres, that will include the first 20,000 acres created by the first Shenandoah well and a little bit more. And that will be split and operated by Tamboran in the same way as it is now. And as I said, we may end up with, instead of having 5% of the 50,000 acres, we may end up with something closer to 10% of this first strategic development area. And then, as I mentioned already, the balance of the Beetaloo of 3.3, that will remain under the existing Tamboran JV, with Falcon having 22.5% and the rest being owned 50-50 between Tamboran and Daily Waters. The big benefits of the checkerboard. Clearly, if you're going to have a checkerboard executed and Daily Water becomes an operator, well, you're going to have accelerated development in the Beetaloo, because we're going to have 2 operators, not 1. We need more, but at least we're now doubling the number of operators. So the introduction of Daily Waters as an operator is going to increase and accelerate the development of the Beetaloo. More importantly, I think, is when we've looked at farm out opportunities of the Beetaloo, and that's what we've done over the years from back 2009 and 10 with Hess, Origin, Sasol, farming down initially, 70% to Origin, then going down to 22.5%. When we look at future farm downs, it's never been very appealing to farm down any further than our 22.5%. And the reason for this is, for a meaningful farming to come in, they'd look for perhaps 10% as the minimum of our 22.5%, and that would be equivalent to selling half the value of the company. Not an attractive proposition for Falcon ever to consider, and I said we wouldn't consider it. But now when you carve up the Beetaloo into these pretty sizable 200,000 acres, but there's still only 200,000 acres out of the 4.6, I think it's going to create a lot more M&A opportunities, a lot more farm out opportunities, both for Falcon, for Tamboran, for Daily Waters. And then it'll be, because of the size of each of these of 200,000 acres, it'll be attractive for US majors to come in. Perhaps alongside Tamboran, alongside Daily Waters, and alongside indeed Falcon, where they're coming in to join an operator like Daily Waters for 20 or 30%. They might want a bit more. Daily Waters might not want to go down below 50 or 60%. We might participate in a farm down of just one of our blocks, but certainly would never contemplate farming down out of any piece of the total of 4.6. So this checkerboard, when it gets implemented, as I said, increases the attractiveness of farm out and farm in opportunities. So significant increase in our optionality as we go forward. Where will the checkerboard be? Again, it's not Falcon's gift to determine the checkerboard area. I can only assume at this stage that it's going to be around the deeper part of the basin, perhaps. But as I said, I have no visibility on where it's going to be, other than it's going to be somewhere in the order of the total of 1.2, 1.3 million acres, which is roughly this area, this deeper part of the basin here. But as I said, excluding this strategic development area around the current pilot. So that's pretty much everything today in terms of updating you. A lot of exciting stuff going on with the pilot, which will kick off in earnest in the next month or two with the drilling of the first of 2 wells. And as I said, Liberty Energy will come on site. We're ready to frack those wells before the end of the year. We should have initial flow rates by the end of the year. We will, as I said, do an extended production test on at least one of those wells into the new year. But we'll have we'll have initial production tests by the end of the year, and then we'll start a drilling program in April, May of the following year to drill 4 wells and frack those 4 wells, and then hook that up into production by close to the end of the year into Q1 next year. So we're selling gas to the Northern Territory government by the first half of 2026. So if I can maybe hand back to Jake. In terms of any potential Q&As that have come in. I know there's a few pre-submitted Q&As. So if you want to maybe start with those, Jake.
Absolutely, Philip, and thank you very much for your presentation this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, please do continue to submit your questions just by using the Q&A tab that's situated on the top right corner of your screen. But just while we take a few moments to review those questions that were submitted already, I'd just like to remind you that a recording of this presentation, along with a copy of the slides and the published Q&A, can be accessed via your investor dashboard. Philip, as you quite rightly say, we did receive a number of pre-submitted questions ahead of today's event. So perhaps if we dive straight into those before then turning to the live ones, that would be great. The first question that we have here asks, the share price is currently trading close to all-time lows. When do you believe the share price will start to show gains to the upside?
Yeah, look, we're all pretty disappointed as to how the share price reacted to what we, Tamber and Daily Waters, believe to be fantastic news earlier this year. And also would have actually expected the complete opposite. An increase, a significant increase in all our share prices we would have seen or would have expected to see. But I don't think the market fully appreciated the significance of the flow rates. And I think they also know that both Tamber, particularly as operator, and ourselves, there's a need to go out and raise money because obviously we want to go into this pilot. And this knowledge by the market of us having to raise money can often hold the share price back, and in fact can even hurt the share price in the short term. And I think that's what we've seen going on since February of this year is certainly a damaging to our share price, which I believe to be very much short term. In terms of what we can expect to see, in terms of a share price appreciation, Tamron, as I mentioned earlier, they filed their S1. They're moving forward on an IPO on the New York Stock Exchange. There's a further press release and update yesterday, and I believe they're targeting at the outer end something in the region of $175 million raise, which would be a fantastic result for Tamron, but also for the Beetaloo. I'm not sure the exact timing of that, but perhaps it's going to be before the end of this month. But again, I think that will be a significant endorsement. It's not about the direct read-through and the valuation of this deal and what it means in terms of the value per acre for Tamber and what price they're doing it at, but the fact that they were able to IPO their company on the New York Stock Exchange and get the following support and raise something up to, let's say it's 150 million even, that will be a significant positive development, which should reflect well on Falcon and any other player in the Beetaloo, including Empire. Secondly, and more importantly, I think will be the starting of the drilling in the next 6 to 8 weeks. And the pilot will get underway. And then the real increase may not happen until we start seeing these initial flow rates by the end of the year.
Perfect. Thanks, Philip. Just turning to the next question, which asks, what is the latest position in South Africa?
Gosh, what are we, 15 years later? And no great update from South Africa. As I've said, year after year after year, we're still waiting for the proper legislation to be put in place. It's not. And until it's in place, they're not even in a position to grant an exploration license. We still hold the technical cooperation permit over about 7 million acres that they can't take away from us. But right now, there's no update whatsoever, unfortunately.
Perfect. Thank you. When do you expect gas sales to happen, and how much per barrel would you be looking to sell the gas at?
Gas sales to happen first half of 2026. So as I said, drilling in 24, drilling in 25, hook it all up, and then be selling gas before the end of the first half of 2026. And that gas, as I said, is going to be sold under the gas sales agreement between ourselves the JV partners, and the Northern Territory government to sell 40 million scuffs of gas a day. In terms of the price of gas, rather than the per barrel of oil, but per MCF, price of gas typically on the JKM, which is the Japan-Korean market for pricing, for export of gas, which we're not doing, that's a very, very robust $13 US per MCF. But if you look more to the domestic market, particularly on the East Coast, you're looking at Australian $1.10. So that's a kind of a good idea in terms of what the market is. And certainly when you compare that to US prices, and anyone on the call will be very familiar with Henry Hub prices in around $2.50, $2.60. So it's a pretty big step up from what one can get for gas in the US of A.
Thanks, Philip. The next question that we have here talks to the recent fundraise and really asks, why did you do a fundraise at a ridiculously low 6p per share when only 2 months earlier the price was double that?
Yeah, look, again, a good question. We hate having to raise money. In fact, we don't like raising money, period, unless we have to. We certainly don't like raising money, at these, you call it correctly, this derisory price of 6p. We do want to be funded for our 5%. So we don't want to go naked into a pilot development and not having any money at all. But what we did consciously do at the time was, because the way the market reacted to basically halving our share price, rather than going out and raising, roughly $35 million this year and significantly diluting our shareholders, we reduced the equity raise to less than $5 million. And we've done that by reducing our interest down to 5%. And again, by just giving up less than 1% of the acres. So it is a situation, we don't generate cash flow, so we do need money. Our carry is, there's a small bit of carry left that kicks in on the 1st of July, about 3.75 million Aussie dollars, I believe it is. But we do need to be able to finance our 5% share of the pilot and all the other auxiliary costs. So we did have to raise some money, but as I said, we limited that raise to the absolute bare minimum, given particularly where the share price is at.
Thank you. Have there been any discussions with Tamboran about them acquiring Falcon?
Simple answer, no. None whatsoever, no.
Perfect. The next question really looks to the future and asks, what is your strategy for the future?
There's a good question. I could take half an hour maybe no, I'm kidding. Look, our strategy, and I've been very public about what our strategy has been as a company, is to build value and monetize by exiting. But maybe that strategy may evolve a little bit over the next 6 months or so, particularly with the introduction of the DSUs, and we see now how they're working, particularly and also to our advantage. But more importantly, because of the introduction of the checkerboard, whereby instead of exiting as one way to monetize and create value, maybe there's an alternative in terms of how we might reshape and how our strategy might evolve over time. Not today or tomorrow, but certainly over the next year or 2 years. And maybe there's opportunities, as I said earlier when I was talking about the checkerboard, maybe there's opportunities to do M&A activity on a single piece of the checkerboard. So, for example, at the 200,000 acres, we're at 22.5%. Maybe we go down to 12.5% of that, and that will finance the development of that entire checkerboard. And as it does that, it's proving up the other pieces of the checkerboard. So maybe that will, as I said, we're all about creating value for the shareholders, and we can do that in many, many different ways. Exiting today or tomorrow or at the end of the pilot when it's up and running in early 26 may not be the best time to do it. Because when you look at the tiny, tiny 50,000 odd acres that is around the pilot area, there's no way we can capture the real value of the other 4.55 million acres that won't have been developed as much as the pilot. So what we do need to do is better promote the company in the markets that are more important to the Beetaloo, so the US in particular, to get the appreciation in the share price and get a recognition in the value of the company, and build that into our strategy rather than focusing on exit. Focus more on promoting the company, more on M&A opportunities, more on how we see developing this thing, for maybe a longer period than exiting at the end of the pilot. But as I said at the beginning of this thing, that strategy will evolve over the next 6 to 18 months. But the pure straight, let's exit tomorrow, I don't think that probably will not form and end up being the key strategy piece when we see how this whole checkerboard and DSUs evolve over the next 18 months or so.
Perfect. Thank you. The next question that we have here, I believe you did touch on briefly during the presentation, but perhaps if there's anything further to add. The question asks, Tamboran and Sheffield intend to drill two 3K horizontals this year and four 3K horizontals in 2025. Will Falcon continue to participate at 5% in this pilot program?
So as I said earlier, we are committed at 5% for these two wells. We are maxed at 5% in the next four wells. We can't go above 5 because we set our limit by establishing 5% when the pad was being proposed, and that's the max we can go. We don't have to do 5% next year. We most definitely will wait until we see the results of these wells before electing to go 5%. Obviously, these wells are really good. Why wouldn't we participate at the 5%? So we'll be somewhere between 5% most likely, but there's a reason, or whatever reason may be, we can easily go to 0%. If for whatever reason we go down to 0%, I think it's important to note we don't lose any more acres. The DSUs are set. So that will be where we're at in terms of our participation. There might be the creation of one more DSU, a smaller DSU, 6,400 acres in the 2025 drilling program. So we may want to participate on that at 5% to retain our value in this enlarged kind of strategic development area. So we end up in around about this 10%. But as I said, no decision has been taken yet, but it'll be somewhere between 0 and 5%, but it can't be above 5%.
Perfect. Thank you. Do you have any concern that Falcon is vulnerable as a takeover target at their current depressed price? If the two wells this year meet expectations, do you have a plan to promote Falcon stock? With these two wells, along with the planned 2025 wells, there is going to be news that could be used to promote Falcon stock.
Yeah, some very good points in this question. Look, as a public company, you've always got to be mindful of a possible takeover because you are a public company. And when you're a public company with the assets that we have, a net million acres, and at the very current depressed share price, then yes, you are a target. You're potentially vulnerable. One of our weaknesses, and I call it a weakness, is the depth of our share register, or rather the lack of depth of our share register. We have a significant, very important shareholder in Brian Sheffield at around about 10%. But beyond that, we don't have any real visible shareholders that one could mount for example, a hostile takeover of the company. It's not like you can look to our share register and pick the top 20 shareholders and all of a sudden you can talk to 40, 50, 60% of the company and get support for a takeover of Falcon. So while it's a weakness in terms of the lack of depth in our share register, it's actually a strength in terms of being vulnerable to a hostile takeover. The other thing you brought up in terms of promoting Falcon stock, yes, I referenced it earlier. We do have plans to increase the promotion, particularly in the markets that are more interested in the Beetaloo. So promoting Falcon in the London market may not be the best market to continue, or well, not to continue, but to focus all our efforts in promoting the Beetaloo. Maybe we need to look at additional markets in addition to London and in addition to Toronto, i.e. to look more maybe to the US market and how do we go about promoting Falcon in the US, where Tamboran hopefully will be hugely successful in the next week or two, where Brian Sheffield, HMP, Liberty Energy, and no doubt a lot of US money and US funds will be participating in the Tamboran IPO in the next week or 2 weeks. Maybe that's the better market to focus more of our time on in the coming not just months, but certainly in the coming years beyond this.
Perfect. Thanks, Philip. And perhaps if we just take a couple of final pre-submitted questions here before then looking to take any that came in this afternoon. What are the steps that we need to take in order to start drilling again? Do we need landowner agreement? Do we need agreement on water extraction? Where are we with each of these?
Yeah, look, we have everything we need in place. There's been a delay to getting out to start the civils. That is a delay purely because we've had a very, very, very wet season. Much wetter than previous years. It's taken a very long time for the access roads to dry up. But in terms of all the agreements in place, they're all in place. EMP is in place, landowner access is in place. So there's nothing there to stop us. In fact, we are out. Civils work has commenced. And as I said, hopefully drilling will start in the next month or two. So everything that needs to be in place is in place in terms of getting this pilot drilling program up and running.
Perfect. Thank you. Will there be sufficient capacity in the pipeline for the predicted pilot flow in 2026?
Yes, simple answer. So I referenced the AGP pipeline. There is capacity there to take this 40 million scf of gas a day. And that's what we have under contract to sell to the Northern Territory government. So yes, that pipeline has sufficient capacity. There might be more capacity in time, but right now we're just focused on this 40 million scf of gas a day that will be transported once, before the end of the first half of 2026. So yeah, the pipeline capacity is there. We just do need to build this short 30-kilometer pipeline to hook it up.
Perfect, thank you. And that actually concludes the pre-submitted questions that we had come in ahead of today's event. And I know we have touched on quite a wide variety of topics there, but perhaps if there's anything that's come in live that you'd like to cover off in a bit more detail, then please feel free, sir, and I'll pick up from you at the end if that's okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
So a few questions here. Plan for return. What's the plan? Well, look, as I said, the plan is we're out drilling. We'll see how these first 2 wells go. We'll have pilot production in first half of 26. We'll hopefully be at a larger 10% in post the pilot production area. We'll have the checkerboard hopefully executed. So there's a lot going to happen over the next 18 months that will change the course of where we will end up going. In terms of, people ask about when can I realize profit on my investment? A lot of people have been shareholders in this company for a very, very long time, and even longer than I've been on board the company. And people are looking to see when are they going to see a return on their investment. That is getting closer and closer. But I think we're now at a point where instead of stop start that we've seen over the last 10 years or so, with Tamboran starting the pilot program in the next couple of months with a fairly good, ambitious, not overly ambitious, but a good program to drill and frack 6 3,000-meter wells with H&P, with Liberty Energy. We're going to bring in results akin to what we announced at the beginning of this year, and these wells come in something like 18 million scf of gas on an IP30 basis. I think you're going to see a significant re-rating of all companies involved in the Beach, not just Falcon. So again, a question, some years ago, I did a presentation, plan was to develop the asset and sell. What happened with this plan? I think I've explained that. This is an evolving strategy. It may still be the case. We'll never dismiss any potential offer from any potential acquirer. We don't have any offers on the table. We're not talking to anybody about any offers. But the way this whole thing is playing out, we may just need to, as I said, evolve our strategy around what is the best thing for the shareholders here. How do we get the best value? And it may not just be, as I said earlier, a simple exit and sell off as quickly as possible. Sorry, let me just dismiss. What could you say is the end goal here for an investor for Falcon for over 19 years? Will we see dividends from income of product sales? Not in the medium term. Any cash flow that we generate, even from the pilot sales in 26 and beyond, that will be reinvested into. We don't plan on making dividends. Shares finally start to rise. Yes, I think that's what you can look for. And again, talking about is it to build a discovery and then sell Falcon off? Yes, at some stage, but maybe not today and maybe not tomorrow. But as I said, working through the optionality being created by the DSUs and the checkerboard to get a better overall valuation proposition, which might take a little bit longer than trying to do it all at the end of the pilot. So the question is, my memory was Hess did 3D seismic on all the JV acreage. Why is Falcon now doing new seismic? Well, actually, Hess did 2D seismic, very large, about 3,500 kilometers of 2D. But this would be the first 3D program, and that's why we're doing it. We've been getting good news for a while. It seems every time we get good news, Falcon share price falls. Yes, that has happened. And certainly, as I said, it happened in between February and now, where the market uses their kind of perceived knowledge that we need to raise money, and the share price gets hurt in the short term. We've got enough money now to see us into the back end of next year. We'll have a lot of news flow between now and then, and hopefully a huge appreciation in share price long before we need to go back to the capital markets. Positive presentation not reflected in the share price. Why not? What has been done to improve the shareholder value? Well, on the ground, I guess all the drilling will be done and operated by Tambour. And what do we need to do? What do I need to do? What does Falcon need to do? Is, as I said, get in front of the market that matters more, and promote Falcon in the place that matters more. Promote Falcon, where there's more interest in the Beetaloo coming, particularly, as I said, coming out of the USFA. So that will be one of our key things going forward. Let me just see, trying to get some detailed questions here. There we go. Will the presentation be available on your website? Yes. If it's not later tonight, it certainly will be tomorrow morning. Will we be stepping up promotional activity? Yes. Seems very underappreciated. Could not agree more. We need more to do more, and as I said, do more in the right area. In terms of Falcon's licensing end, look, our licenses are a 5-year license period, and then you renegotiate and you get an extension by 2027, and certainly by the development of these checkerboard pieces, these will all actually be developed into development license areas, so they won't be need to renewed. And the goal will be that each checkerboard piece of 200,000 acres will be its own development license. So there's no real concern there in terms of licensing ends anytime soon. Has there been any interest from larger oil and gas companies since there's such positive news? Honest answer, directly to Falcon, no. But look, there's a lot of noise going around the US at the moment, as I said, particularly H&P, Liberty Energy, and Brian Sheffield. There's no question, but I was speaking to one large fund manager in the US in the last few months, and he says every single person in his oil and gas universe is now in the Beetaloo. And what he meant by, he knows Brian Sheffield, but he knows the people at H&P, he knows the people at Liberty Energy, and he knows all his other peers in managing funds who are all investing in either Empire, Falcon, or Tambour. So there is an awful lot more interest. The oil and gas companies, it's still maybe a tiny bit too early for them. They'll probably want to see the results of the pilot before they get more excited about what's going on. Clearly, with Daly Waters stroke Brian Sheffield becoming an operator on 3 of these blocks in the next whatever short period, there may be opportunities for these larger oil and gas companies, as you refer to, not just showing interest, but actually coming into the Beetaloo as well. Clearly, the company needs to raise capital, much better for existing shareholders to do an ambitious rights issue. With the clear potential, shareholders should be willing to follow on this, including something we'll always look at in terms of rights issue. We don't need capital for quite a good while yet. And certainly if there's an opportunity to do a rights issue, we'll certainly look at that, because I do understand why some shareholders would like to participate if there was a rights issue. And that we will certainly do. Question, would we consider a US listing instead of LSE and TSXV? Well, it might not be instead, it might be in addition. We may, and certainly it's something we will look at, as I said, looking to promote the company in the market that matters most. Maybe it's time to start looking at a US market. And certainly maybe it's time to start considering a US listing of some sort. Tambour are doing it, and I'd say we'll probably have it executed by the end of this month. Maybe it's time for us and Falcon to look at something similar. So if there is anything on that, we'll update shareholders in due course. And then another question, how do I plan to fund Falcon's 22.5% share of the drilling costs outside the pilot program? We don't expect much activity outside the pilot program until the pilot program is finished. So that question, I guess you're talking about, how do we anticipate funding the company in 2026 and beyond? Well, look, we looked at the capital markets at that stage. We look at, as I said, farm down opportunities of a single checkerboard piece. There may be a lot more opportunities for us to fund our 22.5% interest outside the pilot. What is to stop Sheffield from buying controlling interest in Falcon? Well, he's got to find a willing buyer, a willing seller. As I said, one of our weaknesses is the depth of our share register. So, if we were to go out and issue more shares tomorrow, which we're not going to do, yeah, Brian might be there to buy those up. Brian has, as I said, already got 10%, owns 10% of Falcons, I think it's 17 or 18% of Tambourine, a good chunk of more recently in Empire. But his real focus is going to be his 38.75% direct working interest in the Beetaloo. That's what he's raised $120 million through Formentera Australia for, to invest in that. But there is nothing stopping him buying a controlling interest. He just needs to find the willing seller, identify the seller, and then acquire that. But right now, I don't see how that's even possible, given that our share register said the depth of it is not there. If Tambourine or Daily Waters decide to farm out a portion of their interest, would Falcon be required to farm out a portion too? Absolutely not. So if, for example, Daily Waters, the one of their blocks, wants to farm down from 77.5 to 50.5, we have no obligation to do anything. We can say 22.5. If the opportunity will arise, for example, that let's say Daily Waters were to farm down to 50.5 and they don't want to go below 50, but the incoming party wants more than the 27% on offer, Daily Waters and or that party may approach Falcon, and we can then elect to or not to participate in the farm down. But as I said, this whole checkerboarding thing creates a lot more M&A opportunity than we would have ever seen before. And I think that covers pretty much, I may have missed one or two questions, but I think that pretty much covers all of the Q&A for today.
Perfect. Philip, if I may just jump back in there, thank you very much indeed for addressing all of those questions that came in from investors. And of course, we will be able to give you back all of the questions that were submitted today, as well as any further ones that do come through. We'll give you those back immediately after the presentation has ended, just for you to review, to then add any additional responses if required. And we'll publish all those responses out on the platform. But Philip, perhaps before really just looking to redirect those on the call to provide you with their feedback, which I know is particularly important to yourself and the company, if I could please just ask you for a few closing comments to wrap up with, that would be great.
Yeah, look, I may have said this before, but look, I'm as excited and more excited than I've ever been about the Beetaloo. We've had a lot of stop-starts over the last 10 or so years. The start of the pilot is really the start of the development of the Beetaloo. The IPO of Tambourine in the next few weeks on the New York Stock Exchange is a massive endorsement for the Beetaloo. The entry of Liberty Energy, massive endorsement for the Beetaloo, together with H&P, and of course the huge support coming from Brian Sheffield. But it's all going to be down to the results of the drilling, and the fact that we are going to be out drilling in the next couple of months. We are going to have results before the end of this year. We are going to then follow that up. There's going to be no pausing of 2025. We are going to be drilling in 2025 and 4 more wells and 4 more results. And when you look at what we did this year, don't forget, it was 500 meters of a result. Now we're going to do 18,000 meters, 6 wells, 3,000 meters each, and flowing and selling gas at the end of all that. So I think that's what we should all be looking at over the next coming months, as we see this Beetaloo get more and more attention, as we see it get more and more developed, as we see more and more positive results coming out of the drilling and of the flow rates at the end of the year and into next year. So hopefully this time next year we have a completely different view on the future of Falcon. We have a completely different valuation reflected in the share price of Falcon and our JV partners in the Beetaloo. Hopefully when we meet again at the next AGM, and I'm sure we'll have opportunity to do this investor meet long before that, we'll be looking at a much healthier picture than this current share price today.
Philip, that's great. And thank you once again for updating investors this afternoon. Could I please ask investors not to close this session, as you'll now be automatically redirected for the opportunity to provide your feedback in order that the management team can really better understand your views and expectations. This will only take a few moments to complete, but I'm sure will be greatly valued by the company. On behalf of the management team of Falcon Oil and Gas Limited, we would like to thank you for attending today's presentation. That now concludes today's session, so good afternoon to you all.
Thank you.